Good Saturday afternoon. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our discussion today for May 18th, 2024, on hurricane season. Today, instead of talking about activity, I thought I'd focus on Saharan Air since it's actually a question that some people have asked me. How will Saharan Air impact this hurricane season? Something that a lot of people tend to talk about, especially early on when the season is just getting started. Hint, Saharan Air doesn't have as much of an overall implication as you may think, but of course we'll dive into it in a little bit. But first, starting off with the NHC homepage, just to kind of get an idea, of course, what's going on over the next 7 days, nothing expected in the Atlantic. And then in the next 7 days in the Pacific, we have two areas of interest, both low chances, and doesn't seem like the Eastern Pacific will really produce much of anything anymore out of either of these areas. And it just seems like the Eastern Pacific as well will kind of be quiet over the next several weeks. Of course, it is only the start of the season there as well. In terms of global activity, though, there is stuff going on globally. We always talk about how there's always some sort of season ongoing in the tropics, in terms of global tropics, even in the southern hemisphere too. And this is actually quite interesting because there is a tropical storm right now in the southwestern Indian Ocean. By the way, this website is from the University of Wisconsin. I love this website, and especially some of its features that it does have, which we'll actually be using throughout a little bit later on. But there is a tropical storm in the southwestern Indian Ocean, and there was actually one, I think, several weeks ago that impacted Tanzania in Africa. I think one of the first impacts ever recorded there. And it's very interesting that there's still activity going on with this tropical storm, Iali. I think that's how you pronounce it. Not quite sure. And then there's another invest area to the east of that as well. So activity is still ongoing in the southwestern Indian Ocean, while in the northern hemisphere, nothing much yet. Taking a look at a satellite image of the Atlantic, you can kind of see that nothing is going on right now, obviously, and nothing will continue to happen over the next several weeks. Lots of dry air in the lower levels of the atmosphere throughout the tropics. Nothing really when it comes to tropical waves yet as well. And you could also see some Saharan air coming off of Africa as well as we speak. And then in the Eastern Pacific, you could also see our areas of interest. You can spot them in the Eastern Pacific. You can spot where the NHC does mark both of these areas, but you could obviously see they're very disorganized, and especially this area off to the east, which is this tagged area, which only has a 20% chance by the NHC. This actually several days ago, and this was talked about in our updates from earlier this week, where the models were actually spinning this up into a potent hurricane, or at least the GFS was. It was spinning it up and actually making it a potent hurricane once it got a little bit further north and then moved to the west-northwest away from Mexico. But the GFS completely dropped that over the last day, and now no development is really expected at all in the Pacific. And it looks like after that, it doesn't seem like there will be much of anything else that does get going, or at least tries to, for the rest of the month of May. So I guess from that point on, we'll have to look towards June. And you can just kind of see with the 850 millibar vorticity as well. Very stretched out, elongated in the Pacific. Nothing is trying to concentrate over one area. And we also don't have strong vorticity signatures as well there too. So it's weak, it's all stretched out, and it doesn't look like anything cohesive for us to be able to track. So the bottom line, nothing happening in the Pacific, and then obviously in the Atlantic, nothing is happening as well. Really no vorticity areas to speak of, nothing in terms of tropical waves yet. But once we do get that, we'll start to see a lot more of these greens fill up over the MDR. And then we'll also, in the coming weeks, as we begin to transition further into summer, we'll probably see a lot less of these mid-latitude systems, which kind of seems to be taking over when it comes to the amount of energy we see out there in the Atlantic right now. But this will go all go away in a few weeks, and we'll start to see more stuff come, at least in the form of tropical waves down here in the tropics. But that is still a few weeks away, and we still have yet to see that transition occur. But it is coming soon. You can trust me on that. Really quickly though, just to kind of go over the models, just to show in the Eastern Pacific, just several days ago we had a system that the GFS was showing would become a major hurricane. It seemed like off the coast of Mexico, and then now just take it out to 7 days. Nothing occurring in the Eastern Pacific, nothing of any sort of major, not like we have anything that tries to concentrate and develop in the Pacific, and it remains that way over the next week. And we can even take a look at the Atlantic too. I'm just going to show the Western Atlantic, and there is actually something, but it's nothing too crazy at least over the next 5 days. You kind of see nothing happens that is too much of a concern for us. And then by day 5, seems like an area of vorticity does surge from the Caribbean over Hispaniola and then into the southern Bahamas and the southwestern Atlantic. Does actually try to concentrate a little bit, but if we look at the relative humidity, for instance, you kind of see that this is just a really broad area of moisture that surges from the Caribbean. Does try to center a little bit with its low pressure, but you can see there's a lot of dry air that entrains into this system, and the low pressure overall remains very broad. Did see a little bit of talks about maybe this being something we watch in the Atlantic, but when this really does come into the picture, it is past 5 days, and it really is only closer towards the end of the 7 day time period. So things are a little bit fishy there. But overall, in terms of land impacts, at least to the Caribbean and especially the United States, nothing happening yet. Of course, it is only May 18th, so we still have a long way to go when it comes to activity. Now, though, since we got all that out of the way, all the typical hurricane tracking stuff, now on to the discussion of Saharan air. Well, first off, what is Saharan air? And this is what Saharan air is. This is a map of Saharan air. It's basically dry air that comes from the Saharan desert off of Africa. It surges off of Africa and deposits itself into the Atlantic. And this especially happens around this time of year in May and June. We tend to get these Saharan air outbreaks where we have these huge plumes of dust, which causes dry air, especially in the mid levels of the atmosphere. And when that happens, we tend to not see much of anything develop in the Atlantic. It's dry air. It obviously has a negative impact on development, and so this inhibits development. In general, this is a form of dry air that happens in the Atlantic. That's what Saharan air is. But when it comes to the discussion of Saharan air and how does that impact the overall season, the thing about it is when we usually get these Saharan air outbreaks, they tend to be, and I actually have a climatology graph, which is by the University of Wisconsin website, a very neat graph. Notice when Saharan air tends to peak. And that happens usually in the early months of the season, especially around July, when Saharan air really becomes its strongest. And that's when we see, usually in July and June, we don't see much of anything in terms of activity, especially in the eastern MDR when we tend to get these Saharan air outbreaks the strongest. We don't really look at development out here in the eastern MDR. We typically look towards the Caribbean and Western Atlantic, although sometimes Saharan air outbreaks do make their way all the way to the Caribbean, and in fact, looks like we do have one right now that is in the Caribbean and into the Gulf. But the bottom line is that the Saharan air outbreaks really peak in the early months of the season, and then watch as we get towards August and September on this map. Notice that the graph for Saharan air decreases dramatically, and by the time we get to September, Saharan air is almost a non-factor in the Atlantic. So it really just goes to show Saharan air is more or less a climatology thing. We tend to get a lot of it in the early season, and by the time we get to the peak season, it really goes away. So the bottom line is Saharan air happens every single season. And of course, with that fact that it happens every single season, a lot of people don't know, or I feel like a lot of people tend to not understand that Saharan air is a part of something that happens on a regular basis in the Atlantic, on a yearly basis. And a lot of people tend to think too much of it as a negative factor for the Atlantic hurricane season. Yet instead of just looking at it for what it is, as a typical thing that happens in the early season during a time of which the Atlantic tends to not be that favorable anyways. But also, a lot of people tend to think that Saharan air not only impacts development shorter term, which it does, but as an overall factor for the season in its entirety as well. And that is also, it's just not true. And we could take a look at that going back to 2020. This is a tweet from Michael Lowry. And this was from 2020, when the most active hurricane season on record in 2020. In late June, there actually was a record-breaking Saharan air outbreak in 2020, in the most active hurricane season on record. And this is what he talked about. This ongoing Saharan air outbreak in late June of 2020, this was June 24th, is by far the most extreme of the MODIS satellite on record. And he goes on to show the biggest Saharan air outbreak before that was in 2002, and you could just see by the graph. It just shows all you need to know. We had our biggest Saharan air outbreak in 2020. In fact, it was so bad, I actually was able to pull a headline from 2020 from the Washington Post, of all places, and they did talk about the Saharan air dust outbreak made its way all the way to the Gulf Coast. And there was also another plume that was in the Caribbean as well, and it caused hazy conditions in the Gulf Coast as well. And we typically talk about these Saharan air outbreaks happening in the Eastern MDR, and that's why we especially don't get much development in the Eastern Atlantic early on, is because we have these Saharan air outbreaks. Well, in 2020, this one was so bad that it made its way to the Gulf Coast, and its effects were felt all throughout the Caribbean and Gulf. But yet, how did 2020 end up? Record active hurricane season. And in fact, we could take a look at the track map of 2020, and you could see we had a record-breaking Saharan air outbreak that made its way all the way to the Gulf, and look at how much activity we had in the Gulf in 2020. Sure, you can make the argument, I guess, that it was very fueled by the late season, but I guess I should also point out to you, just to show how much activity we had in 2020, and also just how active the early season was in terms of named storms that occurred. Although most of them are weak, we got up all the way to Isaias in late July in 2020, and that year produced a record-breaking Saharan air outbreak. The bottom line that I'm trying to prove to you is that when it comes to how does Saharan air impact the hurricane season, it's really not as great of a determining factor for the overall season as people think. It's really something that we look a lot in terms of inhibiting the early season, and why we tend to not see early season development anyways. But in terms of the overall season, usually by August and September, Saharan air is usually a non-factor. And then, of course, that's when the peak of the hurricane season happens. So with that, do not be surprised when we do start getting a lot of Saharan air throughout June and July. Don't be surprised if people start thinking that, oh, the season is canceled. You know the drill. It happens every single year. We have these big Saharan air outbreaks. People start getting concerned that the season is canceled, that we're going to see the Saharan air inhibit the rest of the season. But yet, almost always, come late August and September, there is some sort of big hurricane impact somewhere. And we tend to completely forget that Saharan air was ever a big issue in terms of the season as a whole. And it just goes to show, how does Saharan air impact the hurricane season? It really doesn't in an overall scheme of things. And I hope this video kind of clears things out that people might have thought. But really, Saharan air is just another factor that we kind of look at as a sort of weekly thing that we track in the Atlantic instead of something overall. Because Saharan air is not really something that we could predict in terms of long range forecasting, as in we could predict Saharan air months out. It's kind of like hurricanes, as in Saharan air kind of just happens once it happens, and then once it clears out, that's when we look at things being more favorable for development in the Atlantic. So, with that being said, hopefully that does clear the air about how Saharan Air. Get it? Clear the air, Saharan Air. Oh, whatever. But hopefully that does clear some ideas about how Saharan Air impacts the hurricane season. And I guess we'll have to see how much Saharan Air we'll get from now till the peak. Maybe there is a lot of Saharan Air, and maybe that does impact the early season. But trust me, by the time we get to the peak, especially in a year like this where we have record warm sea surface temperature anomalies and the La Nina in place and just everything else seems to be in place for the season, I bet you by the time we get to the peak of the season, everybody will be completely um, in forgetting, or I should say, everybody will completely forget about Saharan Air being an issue to the overall season. So, with that being said, I'm going to close it out. And we'll see what happens this season. We'll see, what exactly happens with the Saharan Air situation. But once again, just to say, it is not much of an issue, and I wouldn't take it as a huge issue in terms of impacting the season overall. With that being said, though, I'm gonna close it out. If you really liked what you saw today, again, we really appreciate it if you like. Comment, let me know what you think as well. If you have any thoughts about how Saharan Air impacts, maybe you do think that it does have a impact on the overall season. Definitely let me know your opinion in the comments, and I guess we could discuss that as well. But with that being said, thanks for watching. Stay safe, peace, love, and kindness to all, and definitely look out for another video tomorrow. See ya.